Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law. We're going to really dig deep today into something I think is on everyone's mind at some point, tenant rights and responsibilities, right here in Singapore.
Hi everyone, I'm Serene, and I'll be walking you through all the ins and outs of renting here.
You know, renting can feel a bit like walking through a minefield sometimes, especially in a place like Singapore where things can be so specific. Landlords just popping in unannounced. Confusion about repairs, who pays for what, guest policies. It can all be pretty anxiety-inducing.
You really can.
But no worries, we're going to equip you with the knowledge you need to feel confident, straight from the source. Legal guides and real stories from people online.
Yeah, and a lot of that anxiety honestly goes away once you understand how important your tenancy agreement is, your TA. That document really lays down the law for both sides, you and the landlord.
Speaking of anxiety, I was reading this Reddit post, really stuck with me. This tenant thought her landlord was coming into her room without letting her know. So to catch him, she sprinkled some powder around like a trap.
Oh wow, sounds like a scene from a movie. But it shows how important it is to know your rights. In Singapore, landlords absolutely cannot enter your rented space without permission. It's right there in the standard TAs. And those are legally binding contracts, thanks to the Civil Law Act of 1909.
So no surprise inspections then. But then I was on the Singapore Expats Forum, and I saw a landlord saying they should be able to enter to check if everything's okay. Seems like there's some room for misunderstanding.
Definitely. That's why it's so important to have a strong TA. One that spells out when and how the landlord can enter. Written permission from you, the tenant. A reasonable notice period. It's all about clear boundaries. You know, understanding and navigating tenancy rights in Singapore really stresses that.
And it's not even just about getting permission, right? I was looking at Buy Condo Singapore, and they point out that even with permission, landlords need a good reason. Can't be for something small or unimportant.
Absolutely. Imagine coming home and your landlord's rearranged all your furniture because they thought it looked better. Not okay. They might have a legal right to enter, but they still have to be reasonable.
So these TAs, why do they hold so much weight? It's because of that Civil Law Act of 1909.
Right.
That sets the ground rules for all contracts in Singapore.
That's it. That act is the foundation of tenant rights here. It makes sure everyone sticks to what they agreed to. And speaking of sticking to things, Guide to Rental in Singapore has a good point about knowing who you're actually signing that TA with. Is it the landlord directly, or is it a master tenant?
Because if it's a master tenant, subletting, without the owner knowing, well, you could end up in a really tough spot, maybe even facing eviction.
No kidding. It can get pretty serious. And for the owner, too. Renting out an HDB flat without the right permissions, huge consequences.
Yeah.
There was even a case where someone lost their HDB flat because of unauthorized rentals.
Wow. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty a bit. Minimum rental period. Did you know it's shorter for private properties than HDB flats?
It is.
Guide to Rental in Singapore says it right there. 3 months. Minimum for private properties. Yeah, HDB flats, you're looking at 6 months at least.
Yeah.
Good to know when you're making your plans. Makes you wonder why they're different though, right?
Yeah.
But let's move on to something I think we can all relate to. Furnishings. Repairs. What happens if that awesome dryer you were promised in your fully furnished condo just up and disappears one day?
Right. Good question. 9 things your landlord shouldn't be doing in Singapore. Has your back on that one. Landlords can't just remove things that were listed in the inventory, that initial record of what was agreed upon. Super important.
It's like when you buy a used car.
Yeah.
Got to make sure everything that's supposed to be there is actually there.
Yeah.
But sometimes, even if it's there, it's not in great shape. Repairs. That can be a tricky one. Whose responsibility is it to fix what?
You're right. And your TA comes into play again here. Understanding and navigating tenancy rights in Singapore really digs into this. Making sure it's clear who's responsible for what can save a lot of headaches later on. Usually tenants take care of small repairs, landlords handle the big ones, but of course, where's the line between small and big?
Yeah, exactly. Like a leaky faucet. Is that a small repair or a big one?
Well, it depends. If it's a quick fix you could do yourself, maybe it's small. But if it's causing damage or needs a plumber, probably a big repair, landlord's responsibility.
So communication is key, right? Something breaks, needs fixing, talk to your landlord right away and figure out how to handle it.
For sure. Always better to be upfront and avoid misunderstandings or bigger problems later.
Back again on Singapore Property Talk Law. Still digging into this whole tenant rights and responsibilities thing, exploring some of those tricky situations you might run into when you're renting a place here in Singapore.
And, oh, there are a few. But that's what we're here for, to shed some light on those gray areas and give you the knowledge to navigate them confidently.
Right. So let's tackle something that's probably on a lot of renters' minds. What if you need to break your lease early? Life happens right.
Absolutely it does, and that's when that diplomatic clause can really come in handy. It's kind of like a safety net for tenants who need to leave Singapore before their lease is up because of something unexpected, job relocation, family emergencies that force you to move back home, those kinds of things.
Seems particularly relevant for expats. Lives can change pretty drastically sometimes. But I guess the details of that diplomatic clause, they can vary, right?
You're absolutely right. You really got to pay attention to what your TA actually says. Things like how much notice you need to give, what documents you need to show, and are there any financial penalties?
So it's not just a get out of jail free card. Yeah. But it can make things a whole lot smoother if you need to make a quick exit. But what about those situations where you don't have a diplomatic clause, or it just doesn't apply to your situation?
Well, then you're basically breaking the lease, and that can hit your wallet pretty hard. Might have to say goodbye to your security deposit or even pay rent for the rest of the lease.
Ouch. That sounds painful.
It definitely can be, and that's another reason why knowing your TA inside and out is so important. It'll tell you exactly what happens if you end things early. And if you think you might need to break your lease, talk to your landlord right away.
Communication is key. See if you can work something out, maybe find someone to take over the lease.
Exactly. A lot of times, landlords are open to being flexible, especially if you've been a good tenant and you have a decent relationship with them.
Okay. So let's switch gears a bit. Maintenance and repairs. That dripping faucet that never gets fixed, or that crack in the wall that just seems to appear out of nowhere. Who's responsible for what?
It's a great question, and one that understanding and navigating tenancy rights in Singapore really gets into. Having a crystal clear understanding of who's responsible for maintenance and repairs, as outlined in your TA, can prevent a lot of headaches down the line. Typically, tenants are expected to handle those smaller repairs, while landlords are responsible for the big stuff.
But like with so many things in life,
Yeah.
it's not always so clear cut, right?
Right.
What's minor versus major can be pretty subjective.
You're telling me. That's why having a good inventory at the beginning of your lease is important. If it's documented that the washing machine was already on its last legs when you moved in, you're less likely to be held responsible if it completely breaks down a few months later.
So document, 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 take photos, write things down, send emails, whatever it takes to have a record of the property's condition. Speaking of documentation, I was surprised to learn that landlords can't just spring renovation work on you without your say-so.
It's true. Of course, if there are those urgent repairs that need to be done, that's different. But when it comes to non-essential upgrades, like adding a new feature wall or retiling the bathroom, they need to get your agreement, preferably in writing.
Makes sense. You're paying rent to live in a peaceful and, livable place, not to live in a construction zone.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that you, as the tenant, can't be forced to accept those unofficial fixes or DIY solutions that compromise your safety or the functionality of the property.
So no more masking tape on exposed wires. It's good to know that there are laws in place to prevent that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Your safety and well-being are paramount, and your landlord has a responsibility to ensure the property is properly maintained and safe to live in. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a topic that's particularly important: your privacy and security as a tenant.
Yeah, this is where things get a bit more serious. Thinking back to that story about the tenant who used powder to check if her landlord was entering her room without notice, it really highlights how important it is to choose a landlord who's got a good reputation and to make sure your TA is very clear about their right to access the property.
For sure. Really do your homework when choosing a landlord. Read reviews online, ask for references, and make sure your TA clearly states that your landlord needs to get your written permission before entering the property for any reason other than an emergency. And even then, they should try to contact you first.
Right, no more unannounced drop-ins for a friendly chat or to check if everything is okay.
Exactly. The place you're renting, that's your home. And you have a right to privacy and security. While most landlords are respectful of their tenants' rights, it's important to have those rights clearly laid out in your TA.
Okay, so I think we've covered some really important stuff here, but before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
I do, actually. I think it's important to remember that a good landlord-tenant relationship is a two-way street. While that TA is there as that legal safety net, it's also about building a positive and understanding relationship with your landlord. If you have concerns, don't be afraid to bring them up. Open communication, that's key.
That's a great point.
Both.
And it's also worth remembering that There are resources available to help you if you run into issues that you just can't resolve directly with your landlord. Organizations like the HDB and the Consumers Association of Singapore can provide some guidance and support. Okay, everyone, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dives into tenant rights and responsibilities in Singapore. We've explored some tricky situations, talked about the importance of a strong tenancy agreement, and emphasized the value of open communication with your landlord.
But we're not done yet. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll be answering your burning questions about renting in Singapore. We got a ton of great queries from our listeners, and we're excited to share our insights.
We'll be back soon, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law. Final stretch of our deep dive into tenant rights and responsibilities. We've talked about landlord access, repairs, even that dreaded early termination clause. Now it's time for your questions.
We got so many great questions from our listeners. Clearly, renting in Singapore sparks a lot of curiosity and, yeah, maybe a little anxiety too. We've picked out a few that really get to the heart of it all.
Let's jump in. First up, a question about guests. How long can a guest stay before it starts looking like subletting?
Ah, yes, overnight guests. It's tricky. There's no magic number of days that turns a guest into a subtenant. Really depends on the specific situation and what your TA says.
But Guide to Rental in Singapore mentions that if someone's staying for more than a few weeks, it's probably a good idea to chat with your landlord about it.
Exactly. Short visits are usually no problem. But if your guest is getting mail at your place, or helping out with the rent and utilities, starting to act like they live there permanently, well then it might be crossing that line into subletting. And that can get messy legally, especially if your TA doesn't allow subletting at all.
So if you're thinking of having a long-term guest, best to be upfront with your landlord and get their okay in writing, just to be safe.
Transparency is key when it comes to renting. And speaking of transparency, let's talk about something else that comes up a lot: security deposits. Can a landlord take money out of the deposit for normal wear and tear?
Oh yeah, that's a classic point of contention. We all know things get a little bit worn out over time, so where's the line?
Well, 9 things your landlord shouldn't be doing in Singapore is pretty clear on this. Landlords can't deduct from your deposit for reasonable wear and tear. Things like faded paint, carpets that are a little worn, small scratches on the furniture. That's just normal from living in a place.
So no deductions for a little coffee stain on the rug.
Nope. But damage that goes beyond normal wear and tear, that's different. Like if you accidentally put a hole in the wall or break a piece of furniture, then the landlord might be able to take money from your deposit to cover the repairs.
Makes sense. It's about taking care of the property, right? Just like you would with your own place. Okay, here's a question that's a bit sensitive but important.
Hey.
Can a landlord discriminate against potential tenants based on race, religion, or nationality?
Absolutely not. No way. Singapore has really strong laws against discrimination, and that includes housing. Everyone should have an equal chance to find a place to live.
So no Indians, no Filipino sign.
Exactly. That's illegal and goes against everything Singapore stands for in terms of fairness and equality. If you think you've been discriminated against, don't hesitate to report it.
Good to know those protections are there.
Oh.
Okay, last question. This one's all about building a good landlord-tenant relationship. How can I make sure there's open communication and avoid conflict with my landlord?
That's a great question. It goes beyond just the legal stuff. I think it starts with respect, remembering that everyone involved is a person.
Right. A little empathy can go a long way.
Definitely. Be proactive about communicating. Any issues, any concerns, bring them up. Something breaks, let your landlord know immediately. Try to be understanding if they need to come in for repairs or inspections. And if you disagree about something, try to stay calm and focus on finding a solution.
No passive-aggressive notes on the fridge.
Exactly. Remember, a good relationship with your landlord benefits everyone. It makes living there more pleasant, and it helps avoid stress and arguments down the line.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into tenant rights and responsibilities here in Singapore. We've explored the rules, the tricky parts, and some tips for building a good relationship with your landlord.
Remember, the more you know about your rights and responsibilities as a tenant, the more confident you'll be.
Absolutely. And as always, if you have any more questions, reach out. We're always here to help.
Thanks for listening to Singapore Property Talk Law.
See you next time.